Hi guys, imagine a city where a single crumb of bread is worth more than a diamond ring, and people are forced to boil wallpaper just to drink the glue for a few calories of survival. We're about to uncover the harrowing reality of the Siege of Leningrad, a 900-day nightmare where the menu consisted of sawdust, leather belts, and sheer desperation, revealing exactly what the human body is capable of consuming when the only other option is death. This is not just a story about war. It is a deep dive into the absolute limits of human endurance and the shocking things people ate to survive the darkest blockade in modern history. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. The story begins not with immediate starvation, but with a catastrophic ring of fire that signalled the end of normal life for over 2.5 million people trapped in a city that was never meant to be a prison. It was September 8th, 1941, when the German Army Group North completed the encirclement of Leningrad, severing the last road connection to the rest of the Soviet Union and effectively locking the gate on a metropolis roughly the size of Chicago. For the American audience, it is hard to fathom the scale of this isolation, because imagine if New York City was suddenly cut off from the rest of the world, with no food trucks, no ships, and no trains coming in while winter was fast approaching. At the very start of the siege, the most devastating blow to the city's food supply happened almost immediately, when the Luftwaffe launched a massive incendiary raid targeting the Badayev warehouses, which were the central storage facilities for the city's grain and sugar reserves. Witnesses recalled seeing a thick black smoke blocking out the sun and a sickeningly sweet smell permeating the air as tons of sugar melted and soaked into the earth. A tragic loss that would haunt the starving population in the months to come, because that soil, saturated with burnt sugar, would later be dug up and sold at exorbitant prices on the black market to be boiled down into a gritty syrup. The destruction of the Badayev warehouses was a psychological turning point, because it signalled to every citizen that the days of plenty were over. Yet in those early weeks of autumn, few could predict that they were facing a famine that would claim nearly 1 million lives. The city administration scrambled to inventory what was left, and the numbers were terrifyingly low, with flour reserves sufficient for only 35 days, cereals for 30 days, and meat for 33 days, assuming normal consumption, which was immediately halted in favour of strict rationing. It is crucial to understand that before the siege, Leningrad was a cultural hub accustomed to European standards of living, with cafes, theatres and bakeries, so the transition to survival mode was a jarring shock that stripped away civilization layer by layer. As the first snows began to fall earlier than usual in October, the reality of the blockade set in, not just as a military operation, but as a calculated strategy by Hitler, who had expressly ordered that the city was not to be accepted even if it offered to surrender, intending instead to starve it into submission and wipe it from the face of the earth. The noose tightened, and the food supply lines across Lake Ladoga were not yet established as the famous Road of Life, leaving the city reliant on meagre stockpiles that were dwindling by the hour. The ration cards became the most valuable document a person could possess, more important than money or identification, because losing a ration card meant a guaranteed death sentence in a system where food could not be bought, only distributed. In this first chapter of our journey, we see the dismantling of the city's infrastructure as restaurants closed, communal canteens ran out of stock, and the caloric intake of the average worker began to plummet below the minimum required to maintain body heat in the freezing Russian north. The initial reduction of bread rations was met with anxiety, but it was still real bread made from flour, unlike the abominable mixtures of cellulose and industrial byproducts that would come later. We must grasp the atmosphere of that first month, where the sounds of air raid sirens became the soundtrack to dinner, and the conversation at every table shifted from daily gossip to the singular, obsessive topic of food. The authorities tried to maintain order and morale, broadcasting symphonies and news of resistance. Yet the biological clock of starvation had started ticking for everyone from factory workers to school children. This was the calm before the true storm, a period where the pantry was empty but the body still had some reserves, and hope was still alive that the siege would be broken quickly by the Red Army. However, as weeks turned into months, that hope was replaced by a grim determination to simply wake up the next day. The strategic bombing continued to target not just military installations, but the very infrastructure of survival, destroying water pumps and electricity grids, forcing people to navigate a freezing, darkening city in search of their daily ration. The norm of food distribution began to slide dangerously low, and the psychological impact of seeing the first bodies on the streets, not from bombs but from exhaustion, marked the beginning of the true hell that we will explore in detail. This introduction sets the stage for a descent into a culinary underworld where chemistry and desperation collided, leading to the creation of food substitutes that challenge our understanding of biology and nutrition. As we move forward, remember that every gram of food we discuss was paid for in blood and suffering, and the ingenuity displayed by the chefs and scientists of Leningrad was a heroic battle against the inevitable mathematics of starvation. As the temperature plummeted to record lows in late 1941, the definition of bread began to shift from a staple food to a scientifically engineered substance designed to fill stomachs rather than provide nutrition, marking the beginning of the most critical phase of the starvation, where the bread recipe itself became a desperate experiment in chemistry. To understand what the citizens of Leningrad were actually eating, you have to look at the horrifying ingredients list that the central bakeries were forced to adopt because pure flour had become a myth, replaced by a concoction that included rye flour, bran, oil cake, which is normally used for cattle feed, and the most infamous ingredient of all known as edible cellulose. This cellulose was essentially hydrolyzed wood fibre, a sawdust-like additive that had zero nutritional value but provided the necessary bulk to make the dough hold its shape, meaning that people were effectively eating treated wood to trick their bodies into feeling full. By November and December of 1941, the bread contained up to 40% of these substitutes, resulting in a loaf that was heavy, damp, and clay-like, with a bitter, grassy aftertaste that lingered in the mouth. For an American audience used to fluffy white sandwich bread, visualize a dense, dark brick that was wet to the touch and would sink in water, often comprised of 60 to 70% water content just to add weight to the ration. This brings us to the most iconic and tragic number of the entire siege, which is 125 grams, the daily ration allotted to dependents, children, and the elderly during the darkest weeks of the blockade. To visualize this, imagine a slice of bread slightly thicker than a standard piece of toast, or roughly the size of a bar of soap, and understand that this tiny, sodden lump was the only solid food a person might consume for 24 hours. This 125-gram slice was life itself, and the ritual of collecting it became a sacred and dangerous task, where people would stand in line for hours in freezing temperatures, clutching their ration cards with freezing fingers, knowing that if they lost that card or if it was stolen, they were as good as dead. The bakeries became fortresses, guarded against desperate crowds, and the bread itself was treated with more reverence than gold, because in this economy, a gold watch might buy you a single extra ration, but the ration itself bought you one more day of life. The reduction of rations happened in 5 stages, each one slicing away a little more hope, and by the time the lowest limit was reached on November 20th, 1941, the city was entering a state of mass dystrophy. It is important to note that the bread was often adulterated with other fillers found in the industrial city, such as cottonseed cake, which contained a toxic substance called gossypol that had to be removed through high-temperature processing, a method that removed the poison but left a distinct unpleasant flavour. The bakers worked in unheated factories where the dough would sometimes freeze before it could be baked, requiring immense physical effort to knead the heavy sawdust-laden mixture. This bread did not toast. If you put it near a fire, it would steam and form a hard crust while remaining gummy inside, and many survivors recalled how they would slice their tiny portion into microscopic crumbs to make the eating process last as long as possible, dissolving each crumb on their tongue to extract every ounce of flavour. The psychological obsession with this black bread was all-consuming, leading to a phenomenon where starving people would dream vividly of loaves of bread, only to wake up to the gnawing emptiness of a stomach shrinking against the spine. Despite its wretched composition, this siege bread is credited with saving millions because, without the addition of cellulose and industrial additives to stretch the limited flour reserves, the supply would have run out completely weeks earlier, leading to total annihilation. The scientists at the All-Union Institute of Plant Industry played a crucial role here, refusing to eat the precious seed collection they were guarding, which we will touch upon later, while simultaneously advising the city on what industrial byproducts could be theoretically digested by the human gut without causing immediate death. This specific block of the story highlights that the battle for Leningrad was not just fought with guns and artillery, but with baking pans and chemical formulas, as the city administration tried to calculate exactly how little a human being needed to function before their organs began to fail. We see here the transition from hunger to starvation, a medical distinction where the body begins to consume its own muscle and fat reserves, and the erratic, high-fibre composition of the bread often led to severe dysentery, which in the freezing cold of a besieging winter was often fatal. As the siege bread rations dwindled to fatal levels, the starving population was forced to look beyond traditional food sources and turn towards inedible household items, sparking a terrifying culinary innovation where the boundary between furniture and food completely dissolved. This brings us to the era of joiner's glue and leather, a chapter in the siege where hunger drove people to consume the very clothes on their backs and the adhesives holding their furniture together. For an American audience, the closest comparison is imagining boiling down your old leather baseball glove or the glue from a woodworking kit to make a family dinner, because that is exactly what happened in thousands of Leningrad apartments. Joiner's glue, known locally as Stolyani clay, became a prized commodity because, unlike modern chemical adhesives, this old-school glue was made from animal bones and fish offal, meaning it technically contained protein. People would hunt through hardware stores or peel apart old furniture to find hard slabs of this brown, foul-smelling glue, which they would then boil in water to create a thick, murky broth that smelled of rotting meat and vinegar. The smell was reportedly nauseating, a stench that permeated stairwells, but when the liquid cooled, it solidified into a rubbery substance that resembled meat jelly or aspic, locally called student, which could be sliced and eaten. It provided a sensation of fullness and a minuscule amount of calories, although it often contained impurities that wreaked havoc on already weakened digestive systems. But the desperation did not stop at glue. It extended to leather goods, specifically those made from pigskin or cowhide, which were hunted down in closets and attics with the intensity of a treasure hunt. Belts, briefcases, heavy coats, and even drive belts from factory machinery were brought into the kitchen to be processed into food. The recipe for a leather belt was complex and time-consuming. First, the metal buckle and rivets had to be removed. Then the leather was burned or scraped to remove shoe polish, dyes, and tanning chemicals which were toxic. After this preparation, the leather strips were soaked in water for several days to soften them, and finally they were boiled for hours until they turned into a soft, masticable sludge that could be swallowed. This leather soup offered almost zero nutritional value, yet the act of chewing on something that had once been an animal skin tricked the brain into thinking it was eating meat. We must also address the heartbreaking disappearance of Leningrad's domestic animals, a subject that is particularly difficult for animal lovers to comprehend, but essential to the history of the siege. By the deep winter of 1941, the city's population of stray dogs, cats, and even pigeons and crows had virtually vanished, hunted down by a population driven mad by hunger. It wasn't an act of cruelty, but a primal survival instinct. And for many families, the decision to sacrifice a beloved family pet was a traumatic event that left emotional scars for decades. A cat was nicknamed a tiger on the roof, and its meat was considered a delicacy compared to the glue and leather often traded on the black market for bread or precious firewood. Stories circulated of people luring birds with crumbs, only to realize they were using more calories waiting in the cold than the bird would provide, yet the hunt continued. This period marked the total collapse of societal norms regarding what is edible, as people began looking at leather-bound books not as literature, but as potential sources of paste if the binding glue was organic. The sheer ingenuity required to extract calories from non-food items was staggering, with chemists publishing pamphlets on how to extract edible oils from paint, or how to identify which brands of face powder were made from rice flour and could therefore be turned into pancakes. This was a time when the kitchen became a laboratory of survival, and the ability to cook a briefcase or a jar of paste often meant the difference between waking up the next morning or freezing to death in your sleep. The psychological barrier of eating things meant for utility, not consumption, was shattered, proving that the human drive to survive will override every learned behavior of civilization when the stomach is empty for long enough, while the consumption of leather and glue provided a phantom sensation of fullness. A silent and gruesome killer began to stalk the population alongside simple starvation, and that was scurvy, a disease caused by a total lack of vitamin C, which turned the siege into a medical horror story. By the middle of the first winter, doctors noticed that patients were not just wasting away, but were suffering from bleeding gums, loose teeth that could be pulled out with fingers, and terrifying black bruises spreading across their legs as their blood vessels collapsed. To combat this, the city's scientists, specifically a team led by A.D. Bezubov at the Vitamin Institute, developed one of the most famous and bitter concoctions of the entire war, an infusion made from pine needles that became the primary source of vitamins for millions. For an American audience accustomed to buying a bottle of multivitamins at the grocery store, imagine having to trek into a frozen park or forest, hack down pine branches under artillery fire, and then process the sharp needles to extract a life-saving liquid. The recipe was strictly standardized. The needles were stripped, washed, mashed, and then soaked in a weak acid solution or vinegar to extract the ascorbic acid, resulting in a dark green, murky liquid that tasted intensely of turpentine and bitterness. It was vile, smelling like cleaning fluid, but it was mandatory. Glass jars of this pine beer appeared in factories, schools, and canteens, and people were often forced to drink a glass before receiving their bread ration to ensure they wouldn't die of internal bleeding before starvation took them. This pine needle infusion is credited with preventing a massive epidemic of scurvy that could have wiped out the garrison, proving that the forest itself was a weapon against the blockade. But the desperation for calories drove people to excavate the very ground beneath their feet, leading to the phenomenon of the sweet earth of the Badayev warehouses. We mentioned the burning of these warehouses in the first part, but now we must look at the aftermath where the soil itself became a food product sold on the black market. The molten sugar had soaked meters deep into the ground, freezing into a rock-hard mixture of earth, carbon, and caramelized sugar, which starving citizens would hack at with crowbars and axes. This sweet earth was sold by the glass or cup, costing a fortune in trade, and the buyers would take this black dirt home, boil it in water, let the mud settle at the bottom, and then drink the brownish sweet water that floated to the top, or use the sludge to make a gritty confection that crunched between the teeth. It is hard to visualize a market where a cup of dirt is traded for a family heirloom or a grand piano, but in Leningrad that dirt represented energy, and energy was the only currency that mattered. Furthermore, the search for fats led people to raid the cosmetic sections of abandoned stores or their own vanities, eating face creams, Vaseline and lipsticks because they were made with organic oils and fats. Glycerin, usually found in pharmacies for skincare, was consumed as a sugar substitute, while others boiled down castor oil, which is a powerful laxative, risking severe dehydration for the sake of a few calories of fat. We also see the rise of duranda, the hard rock-like leftovers of sunflower seeds or cotton seeds after the oil had been pressed out, which was typically used as fertilizer or cattle feed. This duranda was so hard it had to be smashed with a hammer and soaked for hours, and eating it was a gamble because the sharp, fibrous shards could tear the lining of the stomach. yet it was considered a delicacy compared to the sawdust bread. The culinary landscape of the siege was a minefield where every meal was a risk calculation. Would this strange white powder found in a factory satisfy hunger, or was it a chemical poison? There were tragic instances where starving families found industrial oils or fluids that looked like vegetable oil, cooked with them, and died in agony. A testament to the fact that the hunger was so blinding it overrode all caution. This part of the story illustrates the absolute degradation of the food chain, where humans were competing with industry for raw materials, consuming the inputs of factories, pine, dirt, glue, oil cake, because the inputs of agriculture had been cut off by the German Ring of Steel. As the biological reserves of the population hit rock bottom, the Soviet leadership realized that grain and livestock were gone, so they turned to the only resource they had in abundance, wood, not to build with, but to eat, launching one of the most bizarre industrial food experiments in history, known as the production of hydrolyzed yeast. For an American audience familiar with nutritional yeast or protein shakes, imagine a much darker version of this concept, where factories took huge piles of sawdust and wood chips, treated them with acid to break down the cellulose into fermentable sugars, and then used that wood sugar to grow massive cultures of yeast. This wood yeast was a brownish, liquid sludge that was extremely rich in protein, and it became the base for the ubiquitous yeast soup served in communal canteens across the city. The soup looked like dirty dishwater and had a distinct nauseating smell that survivors never forgot. Yet it was a miracle of chemistry that provided just enough protein to keep the heart muscle functioning when meat was purely a memory. Alongside this wood-based soup, the food industry began to harvest everything that had previously been thrown away in slaughterhouses, specifically blood, which was processed into a substance called albumin. This food-grade albumin was essentially dried or coagulated blood clots, sometimes mixed with soy flour or the remaining dust from grain elevators to create blood sausages or blood cakes that were pitch black, iron-rich, and had a metallic taste that overpowered the senses. These blood products were vital because they fought the severe anemia plaguing the population, but they were rare and often reserved for the most physically demanding jobs or the soldiers on the front lines just a few miles away. The consumption of these industrial substitutes took place largely in the public canteens, which replaced the home kitchen because by the winter of 1941, almost no apartments had electricity, running water, or firewood to cook a meal. The canteen became a grim social hub where people would trudge for miles in 40-degree weather, wrapping themselves in curtains and blankets just to stand in line for a bowl of watery millet soup or yeast broth. These canteens were silent, freezing halls where people ate with their hats and gloves on, guarding their bowls with their arms to prevent theft, although theft was rare because everyone was too weak to fight. A tragic detail of the canteen system was that if a person was too weak to walk there, they simply didn't eat, leading to a situation where entire families would die in their beds because they lacked the caloric energy to make the journey to the place where food was served. The distinction between worker ration cards and dependent ration cards became the dividing line between life and death. A worker in a munitions factory might get a bowl of shchi, cabbage soup, with a few distinct cabbage leaves and perhaps a shred of horse meat, while a dependent would get only the yeast water. We must also touch upon the commercial restaurants that opened briefly in the spring of 1942, a surreal attempt to normalise life where, for exorbitant prices or valuable goods like gold and furs, one could buy a slightly better meal, perhaps a cutlet made of minced intestines or a soy-based porridge. This created a stark contrast between the starving masses and those few who had hoarded pre-war valuables, illustrating how the siege economy stripped away the value of paper money entirely. You could be a millionaire in rubles but starve to death if you didn't have a gold ring to trade for a kilo of soy schnitzels. The innovation of food extended to the recovery of sunken supplies. When trucks fell through the ice of Lake Ladoga or barges were bombed, special diving teams were sent into the freezing black waters to recover sacks of grain. This grain, having been submerged for days or weeks, was bloated, fermented, and and smelled of the lake bottom, yet it was dried out and ground into flour, producing bread that had a strange, marshy taste and a crust that wouldn't brown. This underwater flour was considered a premium product compared to the cellulose mix because, despite the smell and the mould, it was still chemically grain. The sheer variety of things that were turned into food, from wood hydrolysis to blood clots to sunken, rotting wheat, paints a picture of a civilization refusing to die, using the tools of the industrial age to hack the human metabolism. As the winter of 1941 bled into the spring of 1942, the culinary narrative of Leningrad shifted from one of total scarcity to a lethal paradox where the arrival of food posed a new, immediate danger to the starving population, centered around the legendary Road of Life across the frozen Lake Ladoga. For an American audience, it is vital to understand that this ice road was the sole artery pumping blood into a dying heart, a precarious route where trucks drove with their doors removed so drivers could jump out if the ice cracked, hauling tons of flour, sugar, and crucially high-calorie concentrates into the city. When these first significant shipments of real food began to trickle in, specifically condensed milk, butter, and smoked meats, doctors faced a horrific medical phenomenon that we now understand as refeeding syndrome, but at the time was simply known as the Feast of Death. Starving citizens whose digestive systems had atrophied and whose intestines were paper-thin from months of processing sawdust and water, would trade their last possessions for a stick of butter or a packet of sugar, consume it largely in one sitting, and then die in agony within hours as their bodies went into shock. The city authorities and medical staff had to issue strict, almost cruel orders to hospitals and evacuation centres to physically restrain patients from eating solid food, limiting them to spoonfuls of warm, watered-down broth or diluted wine to restart their metabolism, yet the psychological urge to gorge was often uncontrollable. This period also marked the arrival of the first waves of American Lend-Lease aid, a connection that ties the history of Leningrad directly to the factories of the United States, as cans of American stewed meat, known as tushonka, and packets of dried egg powder and powdered milk began to appear in the rations. For a Leningrader who had been eating leather soup, the taste of American tinned pork or a specialized chocolate bar was an alien, overwhelming sensory experience that brought grown men to tears, not just because of the flavor, but because it was tangible proof that the world had not forgotten them. The Road of Life also introduced a specific type of food item designed for the blockade, the blockade rusk, or hardtack, which was essentially double-baked bread dried to a stone-like consistency to prevent mould and reduce water weight for transport. These rusks were so hard they had to be soaked in boiling water for minutes before they could be bitten, but they became a currency more stable than the ruble, often used to pay for life-saving services like hauling a sled or burying a relative. At the evacuation points on the eastern shore of Ladoga, specifically in the village of Kobona, tragedy struck repeatedly as evacuees who had just crossed the ice were greeted with hot meals of porridge and bread, and despite warnings, many ate until their stomachs ruptured, leading to a graveyard at the evacuation site filled not with victims of bombing, but victims of food. Inside the city, the distribution of these new supplies was a logistical nightmare, leading to the rise of privileged dining halls for scientists, party officials, and critical specialists. A controversial hierarchy where a top physicist or a skilled tank mechanic might receive a reinforced ration, featuring a slice of cheese or a piece of smoked fish, creating a moral grey area about whose life was worth more to the war effort. The black market during this transition period shifted from trading dirt and glue to trading American cigarettes and tins of condensed milk, with a single can of milk commanding a price equivalent to a month's wages or a master's painting. We must also acknowledge the Churchill ration, a rumoured allocation of dried fruits and chocolate that supposedly came from British aid, which became a legend on the streets, though few actually saw it. This chapter of the siege highlights the complex biology of survival, illustrating that after months of famine, the return to normal eating is a minefield where a simple bowl of oatmeal can be a lethal weapon. and the discipline required to not eat was just as agonizing as the hunger itself. The trucks that returned from the city carried evacuees, and the drivers often shared their own rations, hard biscuits and vodka, with the passengers, unaware that giving a starving child a hard biscuit could kill them, adding a layer of tragic guilt to the heroic efforts of the ice road truckers. Thus, the spring of 1942 did not bring immediate relief, but a different kind of mortality, where the city had to relearn how to eat while still under the constant bombardment of German artillery. With the arrival of spring in 1942, the snow melted to reveal a city that was a graveyard of filth and debris, prompting a massive mobilization of the skeletal survivors to clean the streets and prevent a typhus epidemic. But this thaw also signalled the start of the Green Revolution, where Leningrad transformed from a frozen tomb into a desperate, sprawling vegetable garden. For an American audience familiar with victory gardens, multiply that concept by a factor of life and death urgency, because in Leningrad, planting a potato wasn't a patriotic gesture, it was the only insurance against the next winter. Every square inch of arable land within the city limits was divided up and cultivated. The manicured lawns of the summer garden, the flower beds in front of the Hermitage, and the majestic expanses of St. Isaac's Square were dug up by women and children who could barely lift a shovel. The city administration issued a decree that everyone had to become a farmer, and suddenly the landscape of the war changed. Instead of just sandbags and tank traps, you saw rows of cabbage and carrots growing in the shadows of anti-aircraft guns. This period birthed a new kind of foraging culture centred around wild greens, specifically nettles, dandelions and quinoa, often called goosefoot or lebeda in Russian, which became the saviours of the summer. The nettle was the first to appear, and it was hunted with the intensity of gold prospecting, because a soup made from young nettles was rich in vitamins and restored strength to bodies ravaged by scurvy. People would go out in botanical raids, scouring the edges of the city, the railway embankments, and the parks to harvest these weeds, and the markets began to sell not bread, but bunches of green leaves. Quinoa, a weed that most American gardeners would pull out and throw away, became the bread of the summer, because its seeds could be ground into a flour substitute, and its leaves could be boiled into a thick spinach-like mash, or fried into green cutlets if one had a drop of oil. The culinary ingenuity continued as people learned to utilise the dandelion in its entirety. The leaves were soaked in salted water to remove the bitterness and eaten as salad, while the roots were roasted and ground to make a coffee substitute that provided a warm, dark drink reminiscent of pre-war mornings. The city published pamphlets and organised lectures on edible wild plants, teaching citizens how to distinguish between nutritious weeds and poisonous ones, effectively turning the entire population into amateur botanists out of necessity. It creates a surreal image to imagine a librarian or a musician, gaunt and pale, carefully tending to a patch of turnips in the shadow of a bombed-out cathedral, diving into a trench when the German artillery shells started whistling overhead, and then dusting off the dirt to go back to weeding. The Germans, seeing this agricultural activity from their observation posts and through aerial reconnaissance, ruthlessly targeted these gardens, shelling the parks specifically during the hours when people would be watering or harvesting, adding a layer of terror to the act of farming. Yet the gardening continued because the psychological boost of seeing something green and living, something that grew and produced food, was immense for a population that had been surrounded by death and ice for 6 months. This vegetable campaign produced tens of thousands of tons of produce that summer, a critical supplement that allowed the city to stockpile the industrial food supplies for the coming winter. We also see the introduction of soy milk and soy kefir, produced from soy residue, which, while not as nutritious as dairy, provided a white, milky liquid that was crucial for the surviving children. The Green Blockade proved that the earth of Leningrad, despite being soaked in the chemicals of war and the tragedy of the past winter, was still fertile, and the ability of the people to adapt from urbanites to subsistence farmers in the span of a few weeks highlights the incredible plasticity of human survival. The taste of that first homegrown radish, or the first bowl of sorrel soup, was described by survivors as the most delicious meal of their lives, a flavour of victory that had nothing to do with military manoeuvres and everything to do with the triumph of life over extinction. As the city braced itself for the second winter of the blockade in late 1942, a different kind of starvation story was unfolding behind the thick walls of an old building on St. Isaac's Square, one that represents perhaps the greatest act of willpower in human history and centres around the question of what people chose not to eat even when facing death. This is the saga of the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry, a scientific fortress that housed the world's largest collection of seeds and plant genetic material, a treasure trove of tons of rice, wheat, corn, beans and potatoes collected from every corner of the globe. For an American audience, imagine if the Smithsonian or Fort Knox was filled not with gold, but with the only surviving samples of the food crops that could restart global agriculture after the war, and the people guarding it were starving to death while sitting on top of a mountain of food. The Institute held roughly 250,000 samples of seeds, roots and fruits, and as the siege cut off the food supply, the scientists made a pact that they would not eat a single grain of this collection, viewing it not as food for today, but as the future of humanity. The tragedy and heroism here are almost impossible to comprehend. The rice specialist, Dmitry Ivanov, died of starvation in his office while surrounded by thousands of packets of rice that he could have easily cooked and eaten. The peanut specialist, Alexander Stukin, collapsed and died at his desk, his stomach empty, while guarding mounds of edible peanuts that represented unique genetic varieties. These men and women were not just fighting their own hunger, they were fighting an invasion of rats that swarmed the building, sensing the food inside. To protect the collection, the starving scientists, barely able to walk, organised 24-hour shifts using metal boxes and broken glass to seal off the rooms, and when the temperature dropped to -40 degrees and the heating system failed, they burned debris and furniture to keep the potatoes from freezing and rotting, knowing that if the potatoes froze, the genetic line would be lost forever. They rotated the potato tubers, warming them with their own body heat and breath, sacrificing their own caloric energy to keep a vegetable alive. The psychological torture of smelling the grain, touching the potatoes, and seeing the corn while their bodies consume themselves is a level of discipline that transcends military bravery. It is recorded that some of them licked the dust off the packets or chewed on the paper labels in a delirium, yet the seals on the boxes remained unbroken. By the end of the siege, 9 of these scientists had starved to death, yet the collection survived intact, and many of the crops we eat today, including specific disease-resistant varieties of wheat and berries used in American agriculture, can trace their lineage back to the seeds saved in that frozen building in Leningrad. This specific block of history offers a stark contrast to the glue and leather soup we discussed earlier. While the general population was eating industrial waste to survive, this specific group was starving amidst plenty, driven by a higher purpose that valued the post-war future over their immediate survival. It serves as a powerful reminder that food in Leningrad was not just fuel, it was a symbol of civilization, and preserving it was an act of defiance against the barbarism of the war. Meanwhile, outside the Institute, the city had learned from the first winter, and while rations were still tight, the menu had stabilized into a monotonous cycle of meager bread, watery soup, and the occasional American canned good, but the threat of scurvy and dystrophy remained constant. The seed wardens of the Vavilov Institute remain one of the most poignant examples of the siege's legacy, illustrating that the hunger strikes of the mind are just as powerful as the hunger pangs of the body, and their sacrifice ensured that when the war finally ended, there would be seeds left to plant in the scorched earth of Europe. As the starvation deepened, a new and terrifying economy emerged in the frozen streets of Leningrad, centered around the notorious Haymarket Square, or Sinaya Ploshchad, which transformed from a bustling commercial hub into a grim bazaar of desperation where the ruble had lost all value and the only currency that mattered was calories. In this surreal marketplace, the hierarchy of value was completely overturned, and for an American audience driven by the dollar, it is shocking to realise that during the siege, a priceless 19th century oil painting or a diamond necklace from the Tsarist era could be traded for a mere kilogram of dirt-encrusted rye bread or a few sticks of firewood. The market was a dangerous place, teeming with shadows and whispers, where swindlers preyed on the weak, selling bread that was actually moulded clay with a thin crust of flour, or butter that turned out to be frozen industrial grease. Scams that were not just theft but murder, as the buyer would often waste their last remaining energy dragging the fake food home only to die of disappointment and hunger. The most sought-after items were not gold or jewels, but duranda, the oil cake we mentioned, linseed oil, and strangely tobacco, because smoking was one of the few ways to suppress the agonising pangs of an empty stomach, leading people to trade their daily bread ration for a packet of rough Makorka tobacco. This economy of death created a situation where a gold watch might buy you 2 days of life, and a grand piano was chopped up and sold as firewood to cook a single pot of water. But darker rumours haunted the Haymarket, whispers that terrified every mother in the city, concerning the sale of special meat that did not come from any animal known to agriculture. While we must tread carefully here, historical records confirm that the authorities formed special squads to combat the rise of crimes of special category, a euphemism for the consumption of human flesh, a tragedy born of insanity and sheer biological collapse. Parents were terrified to let their children out of sight, not just because of the German shells, but because of the fear that they might be snatched off the street to become someone's dinner, a horrific reality that underscores the depths of the hell in the video's title. The authorities cracked down ruthlessly, classifying these offenders not as criminals but as animals who had lost their humanity. Yet the very existence of such a phenomenon proves that the siege had pushed people beyond the boundaries of civilized behaviour. The black market was also the place where one might find the Badayev Earth mentioned earlier, or mysterious jellies made from leather, but the ultimate prize was a ration card. We must understand the ration card mafia, criminals who would slash the pockets of the weak in bread lines or break into apartments solely to steal these paper lifelines. Losing a ration card in the first 10 days of the month was a death sentence, as replacement cards were almost never issued to prevent fraud, forcing the victim to beg, steal, or simply lie down and wait for the end. The disparity between the haves, those with access to military warehouses or corrupt officials, and the have-nots was glaring. While a factory worker died clutching a piece of joiner's glue, a corrupt store manager might be feasting on tinned beef and chocolate. A social injustice that bred a deep, simmering rage among the starving population. This marketplace of horrors was eventually suppressed by the authorities, but for the long winter of 1941-1942, it stood as a monument to the collapse of society, a place where a human life was worth exactly 300 grams of sawdust bread. As we reach the midpoint of our narrative, we must shift our focus from solid food to the critical struggle for water, which by the winter of 1941 had become a caloric nightmare that killed as many people as the lack of bread. When the central water supply system froze and burst due to the bombing and sub-zero temperatures, the simple act of getting a glass of water turned into a polar expedition that required immense physical exertion, burning precious energy that the starving population simply did not have. For an American audience, imagine if your kitchen tap ran dry, and the only way to get water was to walk 2 miles in a blizzard to a frozen river, hack a hole in the ice, and carry a heavy bucket back up a slippery bank while under artillery fire. This was the daily reality for Leningraders who frequented the ice holes on the Neva River and the canals, slipping and sliding on the frozen banks, often spilling their precious water, or, in tragic cases, falling into the holes themselves, too weak to pull their bodies out of the freezing current. You might ask, why not just eat the snow? But the city's doctors strictly forbade this because eating snow lowers the body temperature dangerously, accelerating the process of freezing to death from the inside out, and the snow in the city was often contaminated with soot, oil, and debris from the explosions. The water they hauled home had to be boiled, not just for sanitation to prevent dysentery, which was a death sentence in its own right, but because the only way to consume the rock-hard duranda, or the dry sawdust bread, was to soften it in hot water. This brings us to the burzuika, a small makeshift cast-iron stove that became the heart of every surviving apartment, installed in living rooms with its pipe sticking out of the window. The burzuika was the altar upon which the city's history was sacrificed for heat. Families burned their libraries, antique furniture, hardwood floors, and even violins just to boil a kettle of river water to make a soup of wallpaper glue. It creates a haunting image. A family huddled around a tiny stove, burning a first edition of Tolstoy to cook a piece of leather belt, illustrating the ultimate reduction of culture to survival. But amidst this frozen hell, there was a singular shining moment of humanity that focused on the children, known as the Leningrad New Year of 1942. The city administration, in a miraculous feat of logistics, decided that despite the famine, the children needed a celebration, so they organised parties in theatres and schools where the feast consisted of a small bowl of soup with a real meatball and, incredibly, a dessert made of jelly or a single tangerine brought across the road of life. For many children, this tangerine was an alien object, a bright orange sphere of colour in a grey world, and survivors recall peeling it slowly, eating the skin, and keeping the seeds as treasures. This effort to feed the children extended to the schools, which remained open in bomb shelters, where teachers, who were dying of starvation themselves, would use the promise of a warm bowl of soup to encourage students to solve math problems or recite poetry. The soup was often just hot water with a few grains of millet or a splash of soy milk, but it was enough to lure the children out of their freezing beds, preventing them from falling into the fatal sleep of hypothermia. We also see the tragedy of the youth squads, groups of teenagers organised to go apartment to apartment to find orphans or people too weak to move, bringing them water and bread, often finding that they were too late. The physiological impact of this water and bread diet on the children was devastating. They stopped growing, their voices became high and squeaky, and they developed the faces of little old men and women with wrinkled skin and deep, knowing eyes that had seen too much. This section of the story highlights that survival was not just about finding calories, but about the thermodynamics of life, balancing the heat loss of the body against the heat gain from hot water, and the immense caloric cost of simply moving a muscle to lift a bucket. The water famine is often overshadowed by the lack of bread, but without the Neva River and the bazooka stoves, the city would have perished in weeks, proving that in a siege, H2O is just as political and strategic a resource as ammunition. As the siege dragged on into the unending greyness of 1942, the definition of food expanded into the realm of chemical absurdity, leading to the rise of mustard pancakes, a dish that exemplifies the terrifying ingenuity of the Leningrad housewife, who refused to let her family starve even when the flour bin was empty. Large stocks of mustard powder had remained in the city, overlooked by the military commissaries because nobody considered a condiment to be a survival food. Yet the starving population realised that mustard seeds are organic and therefore contain calories. However, eating raw mustard powder would burn the esophagus and cause severe vomiting, which was fatal in such a weakened state. So a complex detoxification process was invented, where the powder was soaked in boiling water for days, with the water being changed repeatedly to leach out the burning essential oils and bitterness. Once the sludge became tasteless, it was mixed with a pinch of flour or even wallpaper glue to form a batter and fried on the stove, resulting in a pancake that had a bizarre, earthy texture, but provided the critical sensation of eating a hot meal. Alongside this, people began to raid the bathroom cabinets for tooth powder, which in the 1940s was often made with a base of chalk and starch, meaning it could be boiled into a thick white jelly that settled in the stomach like a stone, suppressing the hunger pangs for a few hours. This desperate foraging in the medicine cabinet also led to the consumption of castor oil and petroleum jelly, with parents frying these medicinal greases to dip their crusts of bread in, trying to replace the animal fats that had vanished from their diet months ago. But as the humans scavenged for these microscopic scraps of nutrition, they found themselves locked in a war with a new, formidable enemy that was thriving in the chaos: the rat. By 1942, the biological balance of Leningrad had collapsed because the starving population had eaten almost every cat in the city, removing the apex predator and allowing the rat population to explode into the millions. These were not ordinary rodents. Survivors described them as large, fearless and organised, moving in living carpets across the streets to attack the few remaining grain mills and food depots, consuming tons of the precious flour that was meant for the bakeries. The rats were so bold that they would attack people sleeping in their beds, gnawing on the noses and fingers of the dying who were too weak to fight them off, creating a horrific scenario where humans were not only starving, but were being eaten alive by the pests they could no longer control. The city authorities realised that the rats were destroying the food supply faster than the Germans could bomb it, and since poisons were dangerous to use around food stocks, they had to resort to a biological counter-offensive. This led to one of the most surreal and heartwarming chapters of the siege known as the Cat Mobilization, where, after the partial breaking of the blockade in 1943, 4 train cars packed with smoky grey cats were shipped in from the Yaroslavl region in Siberia. These cats were not pets. They were drafted soldiers of the food war, and when the train arrived, people reportedly lined up not for bread but for a cat, willing to pay 500 rubles, a fortune, for a single kitten to protect their home. The first wave of cats was released directly into the food warehouses and museums like the Hermitage, where they engaged in a brutal war against the rodent army, eventually securing the city's grain supplies and saving countless lives by preventing the destruction of food. This episode highlights the fragile interconnectedness of the urban ecosystem. When the humans ate the cats to survive the winter of 41, they inadvertently triggered a plague in 42 that threatened to wipe out what little food remained. We must also touch upon the siege garden cuisine that evolved in the second summer, where the leaves of the beet plant, usually discarded, were fermented to make a sour soup, similar to borscht but without the beets, and the outer dirty leaves of the cabbage, known as kryapa, which were normally ploughed back into the field as fertiliser, were collected, washed and salted for winter storage. The kryapa soup became a staple of the canteen menu, a dark, fibrous brew that smelled of decay but was rich in fibre, keeping the digestive tracts of the survivors functioning. This period solidified the mindset that there was no such thing as waste in Leningrad. If it was organic, it was food, and if it wasn't organic, like the leather belts or the mustard powder, science could make it edible. The arrival of the cats and the stabilisation of the kryapa supplies marked a turning point where the chaos of the first winter was replaced by a grim, organised system of survival, where the city accepted that the blockade was a long-term condition and adapted its stomach to digest the undigestible. As the siege entered its chronic phase, the medical community of Leningrad was forced to rewrite the textbooks on human biology, coining a new term that would define the era: alimentary dystrophy, a polite clinical label for the slow, agonising process of starving to death, which manifested in 2 horrific forms that dictated exactly what a patient could or could not eat. There was the dry form, where the victim became a walking skeleton with skin stretched tight over bone, and the wet form, where the body, desperate to retain nutrients, swelled with water, turning people into bloated, unrecognisable shapes who could barely move their heavy, fluid-filled limbs. For these patients, the standard siege diet of salted water and rye bread was actually a poison, because the salt caused further swelling, so the hospitals developed a specific medicinal menu that is terrifying to consider by modern standards. The centrepiece of this recovery diet was soy kefir, a fermented drink made from soy flour and bacterial cultures that looked like milk, but had a sour, chalky taste and a grainy texture that coated the throat. Yet, it was a lifeline because it provided protein without the lethal salt content. Doctors also prescribed yeast milk, a frothy beige liquid created by mixing water with the hydrolyzed wood yeast we mentioned earlier, which survivors described as drinking liquid dough. But it was rich in B vitamins and helped combat the pellagra and skin lesions that were plaguing the population. It is a testament to the dedication of the medical staff that they would give their own meagre rations to the most critical patients, knowing that one extra cup of soy kefir could be the difference between a patient waking up or slipping away. But outside the hospitals, in the damp, freezing apartments where the windows were blown out and the walls were covered in frost, a new and unexpected food source began to appear: mushrooms. Because the city was dark, damp and decaying, fungi began to grow inside the houses, sprouting from the rotting wallpaper, the damp floorboards, and the waterlogged furniture. In a normal world, black mould and strange indoor mushrooms would be a health hazard, but in the starving city, people scraped these fungi off the walls and boiled them, hoping they were edible varieties, effectively turning their ruined homes into grim terrariums. This foraging extended to the city's cemeteries, specifically the famous Piskarevskoye, which ironically became a source of life. As the spring rains came, people noticed that the grass and berries grew thicker and greener near the fresh mass graves due to the nutrients in the soil. It is a macabre detail that is hard to stomach, but starving families would collect berries, nettles, and even mushrooms from the edges of the burial grounds, suppressing the knowledge of why the soil was so fertile, because the drive to eat silenced all cultural taboos. We must also discuss the role of alcohol, specifically vodka, which became a strategic resource almost as valuable as bread. The Voroshilov ration, named after the Soviet marshal, allocated 100 grams of vodka per day to soldiers on the front lines to give them liquid courage and warmth in the trenches, but this vodka often leaked into the civilian black market. In a city with no heating, a bottle of vodka was liquid fire. It didn't provide nutrients, but it dulled the pain of hunger and provided a momentary burst of warmth that could stop a person from freezing to death in their sleep. However, for a dystrophic body, alcohol was dangerous, often leading to immediate collapse, so it was used more as a currency to buy wood or bread than as a beverage. During this time, a psychological phenomenon known as gastronomic masochism took hold, where starving people would obsessively read pre-war cookbooks, reciting recipes for roast duck and cream cakes to each other in the dark. They would spend hours describing meals they used to hate, fantasizing about the crust of a pie or the fat on a ham, and this mental eating became a way to keep the brain active, even as it tortured the stomach. The libraries reported that while fiction books were ignored, the sections on cookery and nutrition were always empty. The books stolen or borrowed permanently by people who just wanted to look at pictures of food. This visualized the tragedy of a city where the memory of food was the only thing that remained abundant, and the act of reading a recipe became a spiritual ritual to remember what it felt like to be human. The siege menu thus expanded to include not just what went into the mouth, but what fed the mind, proving that in the face of annihilation, the imagination is the last refuge of the starving. As the snow melted and the ice on the Neva River broke up in the spring, a new saviour emerged from the murky waters, a creature so small and insignificant that in peacetime it was considered a pest, but during the siege it became known as the Gold of Leningrad. This was the kolyushka, or three-spined stickleback, a tiny fish barely 2 inches long, covered in sharp spines and bone plates, which fishermen usually threw back or used as fertilizer. However, in the starving city, organised brigades and children with handmade nets, often made from old curtains or lingerie, flocked to the canals to scoop up millions of these tiny fish. For an American audience accustomed to filleting a large salmon or bass, the consumption of sticklebacks is hard to imagine, because you couldn't clean them. They were too small. Instead, people would grind the entire fish, head, guts, spines, and all, through a meat grinder to produce a coarse grey paste known as fish flour. This paste was then mixed with a little water and fried into cutlets that crunched with every bite due to the bone fragments. yet they were life-saving because the stickleback is surprisingly rich in fish oil. In fact, the oil rendered from boiling these fish was so potent that it was used not just for food, but also in hospitals to treat burns and wounds, earning it the nickname siege fat. The smell of frying stickleback, a pungent, fishy odour, wafted through the city in the spring of 1942, signalling that life was returning, and today, on the island of Kronstadt near St. Petersburg, there is actually a bronze monument dedicated to this tiny fish, honouring the millions of sticklebacks that saved thousands of humans from extinction. But while the masses ate fish paste, a different kind of hunger was being fought in the cultural heart of the city, leading to the story of the symphony ration. The city leadership decided that for morale, the Leningrad Radio Orchestra must perform Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, a piece written during the siege. But when the conductor Karl Eliasberg tried to assemble the orchestra, he found that only 15 of the original 100 musicians were still alive and capable of holding an instrument. The rest had starved to death or were too weak to lift a violin bow. To make the concert happen, the city reinstated a special Category 1 food ration for the surviving musicians, treating the drummer and the trumpet player as essential heavy industry workers. This musical ration consisted of an extra bowl of hot soy soup and a slightly larger slice of bread, just enough to give them the caloric energy to blow air through a brass instrument without fainting. The rehearsals were tragic. Musicians would collapse mid-note, and the brass players had to sit because they didn't have the diaphragm strength to stand, yet they played. On the day of the premiere, August 9th, 1942, the exact day Hitler had planned to hold a victory banquet at the Astoria Hotel in Leningrad, the orchestra performed the symphony, and it was broadcast on loudspeakers throughout the city and towards the German lines. The Germans, hearing the powerful music coming from a city they thought was dead, reportedly realised at that moment that they would never take Leningrad. This event highlights the unique food of the soul that sustained the city. People who were physically dying found the strength to put on clean shirts and attend the concert, feeding on the music when their stomachs were empty. Alongside this cultural resistance, we must mention the Blockade coffee, a beverage that became a staple of social interaction in the bomb shelters. Since real coffee beans were a distant memory, the citizens improvised a hot black drink made from roasted barley, oats, and even chicory root found in the abandoned warehouses. In the most desperate times, coffee was made by roasting earth that had been dug up from around the sugar warehouses, boiling it to extract the dark, caramelized colour. This bitter, muddy water was drunk with a reverence usually reserved for fine wine served in delicate porcelain cups that were family heirlooms, creating a surreal contrast where a lady in a fur coat would sip boiled dirt water in a room with shattered windows, pretending for a moment that civilization was still intact. We also see the use of tobacco substitutes as an appetite suppressant. When tobacco ran out, people smoked dried maple leaves, hops, and even moss rolled in newspaper. The act of smoking, even if it was just burning leaves, tricked the stomach into settling down, and a single cigarette rolled with real tobacco, often American trade goods, could be traded for a day's ration of bread, showing that for many the relief of a nicotine buzz was worth more than the sustenance of food. This chapter illustrates the shift from pure biological survival to the restoration of human dignity, where catching a tiny fish, playing a symphony, or sipping a cup of fake coffee were acts of rebellion against the dehumanizing force of the blockade. As the city stabilized its defenses, a surreal battle was being fought in the industrial kitchens of the Krupskaya confectionery factory, where chemists and pastry chefs were ordered to perform a miracle, create candy without sugar and chocolate without cocoa to keep the population's morale from collapsing. This led to the invention of the Leningrad truffle, a grim parody of a luxury sweet that illustrates the absolute limits of food engineering. This truffle contained no chocolate whatsoever. Instead, it was a dense, dark mixture of yeast, industrial vegetable oil, and a small amount of duranda or oil cake, flavoured with a drop of peppermint oil or synthetic vanilla to mask the taste of the yeast. To an American audience, this sounds repulsive, like eating a bouillon cube mixed with candle wax, but to a starving child in 1943, this greasy, bitter lump was a taste of heaven that provided a massive hit of fatty calories. The factory also produced soy marzipan, a greyish paste made from processed soy flour and water that was moulded into bars to resemble the almond treats of the past, and while it tasted like salty chalk, it was packed with protein that helped fight the fluid swelling of dystrophy. But the most macabre sweet of the siege was the hematogen bar, a product that is still known in Russia today but was vital during the war. This was essentially a bar of coagulated cow's blood, albumin, mixed with condensed milk or syrup to make a dense, iron-rich toffee. It looked like a dark chocolate bar, but it tasted metallic and savoury, and it was issued specifically to pilots, snipers and children with severe anemia to pump iron back into their bloodstreams. The existence of a candy factory operating in a starving city seems contradictory, yet the workers there showed iron discipline. Despite being surrounded by vats of soy mix and glucose syrup, theft was almost non-existent because the workers knew these sweets were destined for the orphanages and the front lines. Alongside these industrial efforts, the kitchen chemistry in the apartments reached a new level of desperation with the invention of coffee jelly. Since caffeine acts as an appetite suppressant, people would take their coffee substitutes, made from roasted roots or earth, and mix them with the glue derived from boiling leather or animal bones, which we discussed earlier, to create a set gelatin. This coffee aspic could be sliced and eaten with a fork, allowing a person to eat their morning coffee, which felt more satisfying than drinking it. We also see the rise of pekin, or Chinese cabbage, which was introduced to the city because it grew faster than regular cabbage. The outer tough leaves that were usually thrown away were fermented into a green cheese spread, a salty, pungent paste that was smeared on bread to add flavour to the sawdust. This era also saw the widespread use of chemical sugar, or saccharin, which provided sweetness but no energy, a cruel trick on the body that triggered insulin responses without delivering calories, often leaving the consumer feeling weaker than before. However, the most dangerous treat was the alcohol antifreeze found in military vehicles. Desperate soldiers and mechanics sometimes tried to filter this toxic liquid through gas mask filters or loaves of bread to drink it, a game of Russian roulette that often resulted in blindness or death. Yet the craving for calories and the numbing effect of alcohol was so strong that the risk was taken. On a lighter note, the arrival of American Lend-Lease Spam, spiced ham, became a cultural phenomenon. The tins were rectangular and easy to stack, and the salty, fatty meat inside was so rich that locals called it Roosevelt's smile. A single tin of Spam could feed a family for a week if mixed with enough water and cabbage to make a soup, and the empty tins were never thrown away. They were fashioned into cups, lamps, and even replacement shingles for roofs, becoming a permanent part of the city's architecture. This chapter of the siege history shows us that the human desire for a treat, for something that tastes different from the daily gruel, is so powerful that industry and individuals will go to the ends of the earth to simulate it, turning blood into candy and roots into jelly, just to feel a moment of pleasure in a world of pain. As the siege entered a phase of grim stability in late 1942 and early 1943, the city administration made a controversial decision that introduced a stark class divide into the starving population by opening the commercial restaurants, establishments that turned food into a luxury commodity purchasable only by the desperate elite. For an American audience, imagine a scenario where the only way to get a real steak or a bowl of thick fatty soup was not to use money, which was worthless, but to hand over your grandmother's diamond earrings, a gold wedding band, or a fur coat. These restaurants were official state-run enterprises designed to siphon valuable metals and currency out of the population to fund the war effort, creating a surreal scene where a skeletal professor might sit next to a corrupt warehouse manager, both eating a commercial cutlet that cost the equivalent of a year's salary or a priceless heirloom. The existence of these dining halls sparked intense resentment among the ordinary workers who were still subsisting on the bread and water ration, as the smell of frying onions and real meat wafting from the commercial kitchens was a form of psychological torture for those standing in the freezing street outside. Yet, for many, these restaurants were a last resort. Families would pool every piece of jewellery they owned to buy a single, commercial lunch for a dying child, trading the legacy of the past for a few hours of the future. While the wealthy traded gold for cutlets, the poor turned to a new and dangerous industrial substitute known as olefer, a drying oil used in the production of paint and varnish. In the pre-war era, olefer was made from vegetable oils like linseed or hemp, but by 1943 it was often synthetic or heavily adulterated with chemical solvents. Desperate people would buy bottles of this thick amber liquid from hardware stocks, boil it for hours to evaporate the toxic volatile chemicals, and then use the remaining sludge to fry their bread or onions. The smell of boiling olefer was pungent and chemical, instantly recognizable in the stairwells of the apartment blocks, and eating it was a gamble. If not boiled long enough, it caused severe chemical burns to the stomach and liver failure. Yet the craving for fat was so overpowering that people risked the poison for the calories. Alongside the olefer, the arrival of American Lend-Lease aid brought a yellow powder that became the stuff of legend, melange, or dried egg powder, which the locals affectionately and cynically dubbed Roosevelt's eggs. For a city that hadn't seen a fresh chicken egg in 2 years, this yellow dust was miraculous because it was pure protein and fat, light to carry and easy to hide. A single packet of American egg powder could be mixed with water to create scrambled eggs, or used to thicken the watery soups, and its bright yellow colour provided a visual shock in a world that had turned entirely grey and black. The taste of these rehydrated eggs was described by survivors as the taste of peace, a flavour so rich and forgotten that it made grown men weep at the table. However, the introduction of concentrated foods like egg powder and American dried milk also led to protein poisoning among those who ate too much too fast, forcing doctors to issue warnings about the dangers of a high-protein diet for a dystrophic body. We must also touch upon the soap eaters, a tragic group of people who remembered that old-fashioned soap was made from animal fats. They would hunt for bars of pre-war laundry soap, shave them into slivers, and swallow them or boil them into a frothy broth. This was incredibly dangerous, as the lye in the soap caused violent vomiting and diarrhea, which accelerated dehydration and death. Yet the logic of fat is fat drove the starving to ignore the chemistry. This chapter reveals the complex hierarchy of survival. At the top were those eating commercial cutlets paid for with diamonds. In the middle were the lucky ones with American egg powder, and at the bottom were the tragedy-stricken souls boiling paint varnish and eating soap, all trapped in the same encircled city, fighting the same battle against biology. As the siege dragged on into 1943, the city's survival strategy evolved into a grim physiological transaction, where the most valuable commodity a person could sell was their own blood, leading to the institutionalization of the donor ration, a system that effectively turned the human circulatory system into a food factory. For an American audience, the idea of donating blood usually implies a cookie and a sticker, but in besieged Leningrad, giving blood was a high-stakes gamble, where a starving person traded 400 millilitres of their vital fluid for a Category A food package. This package was the stuff of dreams, containing real meat, butter, sugar, and sometimes even red wine or chocolate, intended to replenish the donor's iron levels. But in reality, many donors were mothers who would faint immediately after the procedure, only to rush home and feed the prize to their children. The Institute of Blood Transfusion in Leningrad became a factory of heroism, sending tons of plasma to the front lines while its donors were barely standing upright, proving that the population was literally bleeding itself dry to keep the city and the army alive. This period also saw the widespread arrival of American lard, known locally as lamb, a product that became almost mythical in its value. Huge white blocks of rendered pork fat, often shipped in wooden crates or tins from the American Midwest, arrived via the road of life, and for a population starved of lipids, this pure white fat was more beautiful than marble. People would slice the frozen lard like cheese and eat it raw, letting it melt on their tongues, or mix it with the rough rye bread to create a siege sandwich that provided enough energy to work a 12-hour shift at the munitions factory. The contrast was stark. The American lard was blindingly white and clean, while the local hydrogyre, hydrogenated fat, was often grey, smelling of chemical catalysts and soap. We must also explore the consumption of casein, a milk protein used industrially as a binder for paint and glue. In the absence of real dairy, workers would steal or scavenge sacks of industrial casein powder, which looked like dried cottage cheese but was hard as rock. To make it edible, they had to dissolve it in water and baking soda to neutralize the acidity, creating a bubbling, glue-like slurry that was technically high in protein, but tasted like wet plaster and caused severe stomach cramps. This industrial foraging extended to drying oil substitutes. We previously mentioned olefer, but by 1943, people were also distilling polishing fluids and shellac, intended for furniture finishing. They would filter the alcohol-based shellac through layers of activated charcoal or gas mask filters to remove the poisonous dyes, resulting in a purple or pink spirit that was toxic but drinkable, a desperate cocktail known as Boris's Tears, or simply lacquer water. This chapter also highlights the pipeline of life, an underwater fuel pipeline laid across the bottom of Lake Ladoga, which finally brought liquid fuel into the city, allowing the communal bakeries to switch from wood-fired ovens, which required exhausted people to chop timber, to fuel-based ovens. This technological victory meant the bread became better baked, drier, and more consistent, ending the era of the sodden clay bread of 1941. The improvement in bread quality was a massive psychological boost. For the first time in 2 years, the loaf crunched instead of squished. However, the disparity between the frontline ration and the civilian ration caused tension. Soldiers defending the city received vodka, bacon, and canned meat to keep them fighting fit, and often a soldier would sneak back into the city on leave to share his rations with his starving family, only to be horrified by their skeletal appearance. This dynamic created a tragic loop where the defenders were well fed, relatively speaking, while the people they were defending were dying behind them. We also see the rise of micro-livestock in apartments. Since cats and dogs were gone, some families managed to keep chickens on their balconies, feeding them cockroaches and kitchen scraps. A single egg from a balcony chicken was a jewel, often blown out of the shell so the shell could be ground up and eaten for calcium, while the egg itself was divided among 4 or 5 people. The ingenuity of the siege chefs never wavered. They learned that if you took the hard, inedible duranda, oil cake, and steamed it for hours, it could be rolled into pastries that, if you closed your eyes and used enough imagination, resembled a dense nut cake. This part of the story emphasizes that by 1943, the shock of starvation had been replaced by a calculated scientific approach to extracting energy from every available source, from the veins of the donors to the paint on the walls, creating a society that functioned entirely on the edge of biological collapse, yet refused to shut down. As the siege dragged toward its final winter in 1943-1944, a new and complex psychological phenomenon gripped the population, known as phantom hunger, where the connection between the stomach and the brain had been severed by years of deprivation, causing people to feel ravenously hungry, even immediately after eating a full meal. This led to tragic scenes where survivors, finally gaining access to adequate rations or American aid, would gorge themselves until they vomited, only to immediately start eating again, terrified that the sensation of fullness was a temporary illusion that would vanish forever. To combat this, the city's nutritionists and doctors urged the population to practice slow chewing, a disciplined technique where every bite of bread had to be chewed 40 or 50 times to trick the brain into registering satisfaction, a practice that turned every meal into a long, silent ritual of anxiety. During this period, the siege menu saw the introduction of agar-agar jellies, a food innovation derived from algae found in the Baltic Sea. Since animal gelatin was non-existent, scientists used this seaweed extract to create voluminous, wobbling jellies flavoured with cranberries or saccharin. These jellies had almost 0 calories, but they filled the stomach physically, stretching the walls of the organ to simulate a feeling of heaviness that starving people craved more than taste. It was a culinary optical illusion, a large plate of food that was essentially solidified water and seaweed, yet it stopped the gnawing pain for an hour or two. Alongside this, the minefield gardens became a reality of the agricultural effort, where farmers and women tending the cabbage patches on the outskirts of the city had to work side by side with military sappers. The Germans had heavily mined the fields and dropped delayed action bombs, so the act of pulling a carrot or harvesting a potato was literally a life or death gamble, leading to the dark local term blood cabbages for vegetables grown in soil mixed with shrapnel and the remains of the fallen. We must also discuss the arrival of American canned butter, which was distinct from the lard mentioned earlier. This was salted, yellow creamery butter packed in tins that required a special key to open. For Leningraders, the smell of this butter was intoxicating, a scent of a forgotten world, and empty butter tins were never discarded but were polished and kept as decorations on mantles, a symbol of the alliance that was keeping them alive. However, the years of eating rough abrasive substitutes like duranda, sawdust and cellulose had caused a massive epidemic of siege gastritis and stomach ulcers. The lining of people's stomachs had been scoured away by the coarse food, meaning that when real food finally arrived, many couldn't digest it without severe pain. This forced the creation of dietary canteens that served mucus soups, slimy, bland concoctions made from overboiled oats or flaxseed intended to coat and heal the raw interiors of the survivors' digestive tracts. The tobacco hunger also reached its peak, leading to the smoking of makorka, mixed with dried potato peels or even dried dung, as nicotine addiction proved to be one of the hardest habits to break even when facing death. One of the most surreal aspects of this late siege period was the jam trade. As sugar supplies stabilised slightly due to the road of life, people began to make jam out of anything they could find: pine cones, green tomatoes, and even moss. This siege jam was a dark, sticky substance that tasted of resin and earth, but it was sweet, and sweetness was the antidote to the bitterness of their daily existence. We also see the role of trophy food captured from the Germans. When Soviet scouts raided German trenches, they would bring back schnapps, chocolate and sardines, which were viewed with a mix of hatred and desire. Eating Fritz food was a complex moral act, a way of consuming the enemy, and soldiers would often trade these captured delicacies for local vodka, refusing to touch the German rations themselves out of superstition or disgust. The siege fashion also evolved in response to the diet. Because everyone had lost so much weight, clothes were held up with rope belts and safety pins, and a person's size was no longer measured in inches but in ration categories. You could tell at a glance who was on a worker's ration, and who was a dependent by the fit of their coat. As the Red Army prepared for the final push to lift the blockade, the city was a paradox. It was better fed than in 1941, yet it was physically ruined. A population of people with healed ulcers and phantom hunger, waiting for the sound of the guns to stop so they could finally learn how to eat without fear again. As the Red Army prepared for the massive Leningrad-Novgorod offensive in January 1944, which would finally shatter the blockade completely, the city faced a new and unexpected medical crisis that had nothing to do with bacteria or bullets, but with the heart itself, known as the hypertension epidemic. After 900 days of living in a state of chronic adrenaline, terror and starvation, the cardiovascular systems of the survivors began to fail en masse as the immediate threat receded. Doctors were baffled to see skeletal patients with dangerously high blood pressure, a condition usually associated with obesity and excess. But in Leningrad, it was the result of the body's fight-or-flight switch being stuck in the on position for nearly 3 years. This medical anomaly forced a change in the diet once again, as the salty, canned meats and American spam that were flooding in were actually killing people with weak hearts, leading to the establishment of cardiac rations that consisted of unsalted porridge and boiled fish, A bland diet that frustrated people who just wanted to celebrate their survival with flavour. During this final stretch, a specific beverage became the symbol of resilience: chaga tea. Chaga is a parasitic black fungus that grows on birch trees, looking like a burnt piece of charcoal, and while it is a trendy superfood in American health food stores today, in 1944 Leningrad, it was a survival necessity. People would chip this hard fungus off the birch trees in the parks and outskirts, boil it into a dark, coffee-like liquid, and drink it not just for warmth, but because it treated the stomach ulcers and gastritis caused by eating sawdust bread. The chaga trade was booming, with boys climbing trees to harvest the fungus to trade for tobacco, and the smell of boiling birch fungus became the signature scent of the victory winter. As the liberation approached, a profound psychological scar began to manifest that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives: the inability to throw away food. Even as rations increased and the bread became pure grain again, people continued to hoard dried crusts, hiding them in pillowcases, under floorboards, and in pockets. This siege syndrome meant that a person would eat a full meal and still steal a piece of bread to hide for later, unable to trust that the food wouldn't disappear tomorrow. Children were taught to cup their hands under their chins while eating to catch every falling crumb, a habit that persisted for decades. If a crumb fell on the floor, it was picked up, kissed as an apology to the bread, and eaten. This wasn't greed. It was a trauma response where the brain equated food waste with death. We must also mention the soy fatigue that gripped the city. For years, soy had been the miracle filler: soy milk, soy kefir, soy meat, soy candy. But by 1944, the population had developed a deep, visceral hatred for the taste of soy. It represented the misery of the blockade, and as soon as real dairy and meat returned, soy products were rejected with revulsion, disappearing from the Russian culinary landscape for generations because the flavour brought back memories of corpses and cold. On January 27, 1944, when the siege was officially lifted and the sky over the Neva River erupted not with artillery fire, but with a celebratory salute of 324 guns, the victory dinner in most apartments was humble yet sacred. Families brought out the intact reserve, a can of sardines or a bottle of vodka they had saved for years for this exact moment, and shared it. There were no banquets, only tears and the simple, overwhelming taste of bread that didn't smell of cellulose. However, the end of the siege brought a new challenge: the relearning of taste. Survivors reported that their tongues had become so accustomed to the extreme saltiness and bitterness of the blockade diet that normal food tasted bland and watery to them. Mothers had to teach their children that soup wasn't supposed to be a brown sludge, but a clear broth, and that tea didn't need to be made from carrots. The Leningrad cuisine had forever altered their physiology, and as the city gates opened to the rest of Russia, the survivors looked like aliens to the liberating soldiers, gaunt, dark-skinned from the lack of vitamins, and moving with a slow, careful economy of motion designed to conserve energy. This chapter marks the transition from the struggle for biological existence to the struggle for psychological normalcy, where the battle wasn't about finding food, but about believing that the food was real and that the nightmare of the empty plate was finally over. As the first trains of the Restoration era rolled into Leningrad in 1944, carrying returning evacuees who had spent the war in the relative safety of Central Asia or the Urals, a deep and silent cultural rift opened up in the city between those who had stayed, known as the Blockadniki, and those who had left. The returning citizens, often tanned and healthy with full cheeks, were shocked by the ghost-like appearance of the survivors, while the Blockadniki looked at the returnees with a mix of envy and resentment, feeling that no one who hadn't eaten the 125 grams could ever truly understand the reality of the city. This tension played out at the dinner table, where the returnees would casually sweep crumbs off the table or leave food on their plates, causing visceral, angry reactions from the siege survivors who saw such waste as a moral crime. This period cemented the Leningrad syndrome, a a psychological condition where the trauma of starvation was so deep that it rewired the brain's relationship with food forever. For decades after the war, blockadniki were known to keep a strategic reserve of dried bread, salt and matches in their apartments, hidden in suitcases under beds, unable to shake the fear that the supply lines might be cut again. But the legacy of the siege went deeper than psychology. It entered the very DNA of the survivors through a biological phenomenon known as epigenetic scarring, or the thrifty phenotype. Medical studies conducted years later on the children born to siege survivors revealed that their bodies were metabolically programmed to hoard every calorie, leading to significantly higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease in later life. Essentially, the starvation of the mothers had flipped a genetic switch in their children that said, "You're born into a world without food, so store everything as fat," a tragic biological adaptation that turned a survival mechanism into a health crisis during the abundant post-war years. For an American audience interested in the science of nutrition, the Siege of Leningrad is often cited as the primary case study for how famine affects human genetics across generations. Politically, the end of the siege brought a new wave of terror, not from the Germans, but from Moscow. Stalin, paranoid about the independence and heroism of the Leningrad leadership, who had managed the city's food supply without his direct help, launched the Leningrad Affair in the late 1940s, purging and executing many of the very administrators and food logistics experts who had saved the city. The famous Siege Museum, which displayed the meagre rations, the bazooka stoves, and the samples of blockade bread, was forcibly closed and its exhibits destroyed or hidden, because the Soviet leadership wanted to erase the narrative of suffering and starvation, preferring a sanitized story of military glory. This meant that for decades, the true story of the glue soup and the leather stew was spoken of only in whispers within families, not in public, making the memory of the food a subversive, secret knowledge. It wasn't until the thaw after Stalin's death that the full horror of what was eaten began to be openly discussed again. Even today, visiting the Piskrevskoye Memorial Cemetery, where nearly 500,000 victims lie in mass graves, one witnesses a heartbreaking tradition. Visitors do not leave flowers, they leave food. It is common to see a piece of black bread, a candy, or a tangerine placed on the granite slabs, a symbolic offering to the dead who perished from hunger, a way of saying, "We have food now, and we share it with you." This ritual highlights that in St. Petersburg, bread is considered a sacred object. It is never thrown in the trash. If bread goes stale, it is dried into rusks or fed to birds, but never treated as garbage. The siege crust became a holy relic in the collective memory, and many survivors kept a piece of that rock-hard, sawdust-filled bread in a glass jar for the rest of their lives, not to eat, but to look at as proof of what they had endured. The culinary history of the city was permanently altered. The recipes for blockade cooking were never written in cookbooks, but they were burned into the minds of a generation who knew exactly how long to boil a leather belt to make it chewable. This chapter of the aftermath shows us that a famine of this magnitude doesn't end when the food trucks arrive. It continues in the bodies, minds and politics of the survivors for generations, creating a city that, even in times of plenty, never forgets the taste of the void. As we close the final chapter of this harrowing journey through the 900 days of the Leningrad siege, we are left with a culinary legacy that is not found in any Michelin guide, but is burned into the conscience of humanity as a testament to what the human body can endure when the only choice is to refuse to die. The statistics of the starvation are so staggering that they numb the mind. Historians estimate that between 800,000 and 1 million civilians perished during the blockade, and nearly 97% of them died not from German bombs or artillery shells, but from the simple, grinding lack of food. To put this in perspective for an American audience, more people died of hunger in this one city than the combined total of all American and British military deaths during the entire Second World War. The siege menu of sawdust bread, joiner's glue, leather belts, and pine needle soup stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of our civilization, proving that the veneer of modern society is only as thick as the supply chain that feeds it. One of the most haunting artifacts that encapsulates this tragedy is the tiny diary of an 11-year-old girl named Tanya Savicheva, who chronicled the starvation of her family in 9 short, brutal pages, ending with the chilling lines, "The Savichevas are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left." Her diary was presented at the Nuremberg trials as evidence of the crime against humanity that was the calculated starvation of a city, underscoring that hunger was weaponized as efficiently as any gas chamber. Today, in modern St. Petersburg, the memory of the siege is omnipresent. You can visit the Museum of Bread, where the black, brick-like loaves of 1941 are preserved under glass, looking more like geological specimens than food, yet they are treated with the reverence of religious relics. Every year on January 27th, the anniversary of the lifting of the siege, the city falls silent, and candles are lit in windows, a flicker of light for every soul that starved in the dark. The siege survivors, who are still with us, are the living monuments of this history, men and women who, as children, ate glue and hid crumbs in their pockets, and whose eyes still carry the shadow of those winters. Their story teaches us a profound lesson about the value of food. For them, a piece of bread is not a side dish, it is life itself, and throwing it away is a sin. This narrative challenges us to look at our own plates differently, to appreciate the abundance we often take for granted, and to recognise the incredible, terrifying adaptability of the human species. We started this story with a ring of fire closing around a city, and we end it with the image of a resilient people who turned the very furniture, the walls, and the dirt beneath their feet into sustenance, proving that the human spirit is the one thing that cannot be starved into submission. The 900 days of hell were a crucible that forged a generation of iron, and while the taste of the blockade bread has faded from living memory, the recipe for survival, courage, sacrifice, and the will to live remains immortal. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but necessary journey into the darkest corners of WW2 history. If this story moved you, please take a moment to honour the memory of the victims, and as you sit down for your next meal, remember the city that ate itself to save the world from fascism.